We like to think that justice always wins, that killers are caught, that evil has an expiration date. But some criminals slip through everything. They kill, disappear, start again. And the years go by, the bodies pile up, and no one knows who did it. They weren't hiding in shadows. They were teachers, neighbors, police officers, fathers, living normal lives while carrying unspeakable secrets. And somehow they got away with it. For 10 years, for 20, for almost 50. Some were finally caught by accident, others unmasked by science, and a few are still out there. This is the story of those who killed and vanished. And the first? His body count defies belief. Pedro Lopez, the monster who vanished. He wasn't a myth, he was a man. And for years he walked freely across South America, leaving hundreds of dead children behind him, without a name, without a face, without justice. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born in 1948, in the small town of Santa Isabel, Colombia. The seventh of 13 children. His father was killed before he was born. His mother, overwhelmed and violent, beat him regularly and eventually forced him onto the streets. By the age of 8, he was homeless. By 12, he was assaulted in prison, and somewhere in that spiral of trauma and survival, something inside him shifted, from victim to predator. At first, his crimes were petty, theft, carjacking, but that wasn't enough, not for long. In the 1970s, young girls began vanishing from remote villages and crowded markets in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. They were between the ages of 8 and 12, from poor families, easy to overlook, easy to forget, and no one connected the dots. Not at first. Lopez traveled constantly, a drifter with charm, who knew how to blend in. He'd approach girls in public places, offer candy, gifts, even money to their parents. Then he'd take them away, and they'd never come back. He later claimed he only killed at dawn, that he couldn't bear to murder a child at night. He told investigators he often sat beside their graves for hours, talking to them, apologizing. But that didn't make him remorseful. It made him more terrifying. In 1980, he was finally caught, by accident. Police in Ambato, Ecuador, arrested him while he was trying to lure a young girl from a market. They assumed it was a simple kidnapping. But once in custody, Lopez started to talk, calmly, casually, confessing to over 300 murders. No one believed him, until he showed them where the bodies were. Police found graves, dozens of them, exactly where he said they'd be, each one containing the remains of a missing girl. Some were just bones, others still had clothes. The scale was staggering. Ecuadorian authorities confirmed 110 murders, and yet the punishment didn't match the crime. Lopez was sentenced to 16 years, the maximum allowed under Ecuadorian law at the time. He served just 14. And when he was released in 1994, he was handed over to Colombia, declared insane, institutionalized for 3 years. And then, in 1997, they let him go. No ankle bracelet, no surveillance, no warning to the public. He vanished. Rumors surfaced that he moved to the jungle, that he fled to the mountains, that he killed again. But no one knows for sure. In 2002, Interpol issued a warrant for his arrest. It didn't matter. He was gone. Pedro Lopez may have killed more people than any serial killer in modern history, and he's still officially at large. No confirmed sightings, no capture, no closure. They called him the monster of the Andes, but monsters don't always hide under beds. Sometimes they walk beside you in the daylight, and sometimes they disappear before anyone can stop them. Joseph James D'Angelo, the cop who hunted at night. He wasn't a shadow in the alley. He was the man in uniform, the one sworn to protect. A police officer, a family man, a neighbor with a trimmed lawn and a quiet demeanor. No one suspected that behind the badge was a predator who would become one of the most notorious serial offenders in American history. His crimes began in the 1970s in the suburbs of California. At first, he was known only as the Visalia ransacker, someone who broke into homes, stole small objects, and left a trail of unease behind. But soon, the crimes escalated. He began targeting women. He stalked neighborhoods, watched his victims for days, and then attacked at night, often while their husbands or partners were in the house. He tied them up, raped them, whispered threats, and vanished before anyone could stop him. As his methods evolved, so did his names. In Sacramento, they called him the East Area Rapist. In Southern California, the original Night Stalker. It wasn't until decades later that investigators would realize they were chasing the same man. Between 1974 and 1986, Joseph James DeAngelo committed at least 13 murders, over 50 rapes, and more than 100 burglaries. He was precise, calculating, and always one step ahead. He taunted the police, made phone calls to his victims, and disappeared without leaving a trace. Then, in 1986, he stopped. No more break-ins, no more bodies, just silence. While investigators chased shadows, DeAngelo quietly disappeared into normal life. He got married, had children, worked at a grocery distribution center. He blended in perfectly. No one suspected a thing. And for over 30 years he lived in the open, untouched by justice. It wasn't until 2018 that everything unraveled. Investigators, using a new tool, genetic genealogy, entered his DNA profile into a public ancestry database. They found a distant match, built a family tree, and followed it to the top. The man they'd been hunting for 4 decades was living quietly in Citrus Heights, California, retired, forgotten, still free. When they arrested him, DeAngelo didn't resist. He didn't deny it. He barely spoke. In court, he sat motionless as his victims, now decades older, told their stories. In 2020, he pleaded guilty to all charges, 13 counts of murder, 13 of kidnapping. The sentence was life in prison without parole. Joseph James DeAngelo was the face of law and order by day, and the embodiment of terror by night. A man who used his badge as cover and his silence as a weapon. And while justice eventually caught up with him, it came far too late for many. Because the next man didn't hide behind a badge, he confessed. And still, no one believed him. Samuel Little, The Confession. No one believed. He wasn't famous. He didn't leave taunting letters. He didn't terrorize cities with a name like Strangler or Butcher. Samuel Little moved quietly through the margins of American life, sleeping in his car, drifting from state to state, surviving on crime and instinct. For decades, he went unnoticed, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Born in Georgia in 1940, Little grew up bouncing between institutions and juvenile centers. By adulthood, he was already entrenched in a life of theft, assault, and addiction. He claimed to have been a boxer in his youth, which might explain the terrifying precision with which he later struck. But for years, his crimes went undetected, not because they were subtle, but because his victims were systematically overlooked. Between 1970 and 2005, women across the United States were found dead, many strangled, dumped in alleys, behind motels, or by highways. Most were women of color. Many were sex workers or struggling with addiction. Authorities often ruled the deaths accidental or undetermined, and few cases were connected. Little had chosen his targets carefully. He didn't just kill, he selected victims the system had already failed. He was arrested dozens of times in multiple states for crimes ranging from theft to assault to attempted rape. He served time, but never long enough. Several murder charges were dropped due to lack of evidence, unreliable witnesses, or procedural failures. He walked free time and again. No one realized they were dealing with one of the deadliest serial killers in American history. It wasn't until 2012 that his past began to catch up with him. Arrested in Kentucky on a drug charge, his DNA was entered into a national database and matched to 3 unsolved murders in California, women killed in the 1980s, all strangled. He was extradited, tried, and convicted. 3 life sentences. Justice, it seemed, had arrived. But then came the confession. From behind bars, Samuel Little began talking. Not just about 3 murders, but dozens. He spoke calmly, in detail, naming victims, describing their appearances, recalling the streets he picked them up on and where he left their bodies. Investigators were skeptical, until he began drawing. Dozens of portraits sketched from memory, each one a face he claimed to have taken. Many matched real, unsolved cases. Over time, the FBI confirmed more than 60 of his confessions. The full count is believed to be over 90. No serial killer in US history has ever been linked to more victims. He died in prison in December 2020 at the age of 80, without facing trial for most of the murders. For decades, he evaded justice, not because he was clever, but because no one was truly looking. His case revealed something far darker than just one man's violence. It exposed a system willing to look away again and again because of who the victims were. And the next killer, he didn't just hide behind a quiet life. He hid behind religion, family, and a mask he built himself, one victim at a time. Dennis Rader, the man who lived two lives. He was a church leader, a compliance officer, a father of two. He mowed his lawn every weekend, led Bible study on Sundays, and sent letters to City Hall when neighbors violated zoning codes. On paper, Dennis Rader was the image of middle-class respectability in small-town Kansas. But beneath the surface, he was something else entirely. Between 1974 and 1991, Wichita, Kansas, was haunted by a phantom, an anonymous killer who taunted the media, stalked his victims, and murdered with a precision that seemed rehearsed. He called himself BTK Bind, torture, kill. 3 words that described exactly what he did. He didn't just kill to satisfy a need, he planned. He waited. He turned homes into hunting grounds. His first victims were the Otero family, a husband, a wife, 2 children, strangled in their own home, broad daylight. Rader later admitted he had followed them for days, memorized their routines, and entered their house knowing exactly what he would do. It wasn't rage. It was methodical, cold. He killed again in 1977, then again in 1985, then sporadically until 1991, sometimes years between murders, but always with the same signature: control, dominance, silence, and then nothing. For over a decade, BTK disappeared. No murders, no letters. Police believed he had died or left the area. The case grew cold. But the man behind it hadn't stopped existing. He had simply changed focus. Dennis Rader threw himself into his church. He became a Cub Scout leader, worked at a home security company, then at city code enforcement. All the while, his mask stayed perfectly in place. But in 2004, everything changed. The 30th anniversary of the Otero murders sparked media interest again. BTK watched from a distance, and something inside him stirred. He couldn't resist the spotlight. So he wrote another letter, then another. He sent packages to TV stations, left clues inside public libraries, included copies of driver's licenses, photographs, and details only the killer could know. He wanted attention. He wanted to feel powerful again. And that was his mistake. One of his packages included a floppy disk. He had deleted the files but didn't know that metadata could be recovered. Investigators traced the disk to a computer at Christ Lutheran Church. The username? Dennis. Surveillance confirmed it. DNA from his daughter's medical records matched crime scene evidence. After 30 years, the BTK killer had a name. When police arrested him in 2005, he confessed almost immediately, not out of guilt, but because he wanted to explain. In chilling detail, he recounted every murder: the planning, the stalking, the satisfaction. He spoke of his victims as projects. He described his fantasy life, his compartmentalization, how he kept the killer and the father in separate mental boxes. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms. No chance of parole. He's still in prison today. Dennis Rader wasn't a man tormented by inner demons. He was something worse, fully aware, fully functional, and completely in control. He lived 2 lives, one as a respected community member, and the other as a sadistic killer who chose his victims like someone assembling a checklist. He didn't wear a mask to hide. He became the mask. And the next man on this list, he did the same. But instead of hiding behind a church, he hid in the streets of Los Angeles for decades while the bodies kept turning up. Lonnie Franklin Jr., the killer the LAPD forgot. For decades he lived in the same house, drove the same truck, talked to the same neighbors. He hosted backyard barbecues, helped fix cars, and waved to passing patrol officers. On his street, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was just the guy next door. Quiet, friendly, unremarkable. But behind that facade was one of the most elusive serial killers Los Angeles had ever faced. In south-central LA, beginning in the mid-1980s, women started to vanish. Many were later found in alleyways, dumpsters, or abandoned lots, shot, strangled, discarded like trash. Most were black. Many were sex workers or struggling with addiction. The police didn't connect the dots, or if they did, they didn't act on it. The killer struck, then went silent, then struck again. Years passed between murders, sometimes more than a decade, but the signature never changed. Same neighborhoods, same kind of victims, same cold brutality. He was dubbed the Grim Sleeper, not because he stopped killing, but because the murders seemed to pause briefly between the late 1980s and early 2000s. But he hadn't stopped. He had just adapted. The LAPD quietly launched a task force, but progress was slow. Families accused the department of neglecting the victims because of who they were: poor, black, marginalized, and they weren't wrong. For years, the killer operated in plain sight, while the city failed to acknowledge what was happening. The break came in 2010 through DNA and a stroke of luck. Investigators collected a DNA sample from Franklin's son, who had been arrested on an unrelated charge. It partially matched evidence from the crime scenes. That meant the killer was likely a close relative. Detectives began watching Lonnie Franklin Jr. They retrieved DNA from pizza crust and utensils discarded after a birthday party. The sample was a perfect match. They arrested him shortly after. Inside his home, they found a chilling archive. Nearly 180 photographs of women, many of them unconscious or appearing lifeless. Some were never identified. Some may have survived. Others were never found. Franklin was charged with 10 murders, but authorities believe the number is far higher, possibly over 20, maybe more. During his trial, he showed no emotion, no remorse, just silence. In 2016, he was convicted and sentenced to death. But he never made it to execution. He died in prison in 2020, at the age of 67. The cause was never made public. Lonnie Franklin Jr. wasn't clever. He wasn't careful. He just knew that no one was really looking. Not for his victims, not for him. He exploited a system that already treated certain lives as disposable and got away with murder for decades. The Grim Sleeper didn't disappear. He stayed right where he was. And the city looked the other way. And the next man on this list? He fooled the world with poetry, lectures, and charm. But behind the writer's smile was a killer with a type. Jack Unterweger, the killer who wrote his own legend. When he walked into a room, people listened. He was cultured, charismatic, fluent in self-pity and metaphor. A reformed convict turned writer, a poet of pain, a public speaker on prison rehabilitation, Austria's shining example that monsters could be remade. But Jack Unterweger wasn't reformed. He was rehearsed. He was born in 1950, raised by his grandfather, a violent alcoholic, in the rural hills of Austria. By his teens, Unterweger was already deep into petty crime. He drifted between theft, assault, and pimping until, in 1974, he escalated. He murdered an 18-year-old woman, strangled her with her own bra. He was caught, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. That should have been the end. Instead, it was the beginning of his second act. Behind bars, Unterweger began writing. Poems, memoirs, short stories. His work was raw, confessional, and disturbingly compelling. Austrian intellectuals rallied around him. They said he was proof that art could redeem, that prison could reform. After 15 years, public pressure mounted. And in 1990 he was paroled, hailed as a literary success story. He went on talk shows, gave lectures, became a minor celebrity. All the while, women were dying. The murders began again almost immediately. Prostitutes found strangled with their own bras, just like before. First in Austria, then in Czechoslovakia. Then, while visiting Los Angeles for a journalism assignment on American policing, the killings followed. 3 women murdered in the same way. The pattern was unmistakable, but few dared to make the connection. Unterweger wasn't just free, he was being celebrated. It took years, but the evidence began to stack up. His travel records matched crime scenes. His relationships with the victims were confirmed. Fibers, witnesses, phone records. The illusion began to crack. In 1992, he was arrested in Miami after fleeing Europe. During the trial, the mask fell. The reformed writer became a man fighting for survival. Cold, arrogant, desperate. In 1994, he was found guilty of 9 murders, though many believe the true count was higher. That night, Jack Unterweger hanged himself in his prison cell. Same method, same signature. A final act written in the only language he truly understood: control. He fooled a country, he fooled the media. But in the end, he couldn't outrun what he was. Because sometimes the most dangerous mask is the one everyone wants to believe in. Edward Wayne Edwards, the drifter who played the long game. He talked his way into people's lives, smiled easily, quoted scripture, gave advice. Sometimes he wore a preacher's charm, other times the confidence of a reformed man who had left a dark past behind. He said he was living proof that anyone could change. But Edward Wayne Edwards never changed. He just got better at pretending. Born in 1933 in Ohio, Edwards grew up in orphanages, correctional facilities, and the kinds of places that turn pain into resentment. By the 1950s, he was already a known criminal. Armed robbery, prison escapes, fraud. He made the FBI's 10 most wanted list. But after being caught in 1962, he went through what he called a spiritual transformation. He wrote a memoir, gave interviews, appeared on talk shows, and America believed him. He became a minor celebrity, a former convict who'd found redemption. He traveled the country, giving motivational speeches at churches and prisons. He spoke about choices, about turning your life around. He was convincing, disarming, even charming. But the truth was darker. Behind the sermons and self-help mantras, Edwards was still killing. In 1977, a young couple disappeared in Ohio after attending a wedding. Their bodies were found months later in a park, shot execution style. In 1980, another couple, teenagers, were found dead in Wisconsin. The crime scenes were distant in time and place, but the method was chillingly similar. At the time, no one linked them. Edwards was never even a suspect. Years passed. Edwards moved often, started families, changed names, and all the while unsolved murders followed him like shadows. The truth began to surface in 2009 when his own daughter contacted police, disturbed by things he had said. Investigators reopened cold cases and began tracking Edwards's movements. What they found was staggering. His DNA linked him to multiple murders, and the circumstantial evidence filled in the rest. He was arrested in 2009 at the age of 76, charged with 5 murders across 2 decades. At his trial, he showed no remorse. He confessed casually, like recounting something from a book he'd once read. He even joked about the killings, calling one couple easy targets. He was sentenced to death. But before the state could execute him, Edwards died of natural causes in 2011. He spent his final days in a hospital bed, guarded by police, with a body count that still hasn't been fully confirmed. Some believe he may have killed as many as 15. Others speculate more, especially given his love for manipulation and his pattern of inserting himself into investigations. Some theorists have gone so far as to suggest he was involved in other high-profile crimes, though many of those claims remain unproven. What's certain is this: Edward Wayne Edwards built his life on lies. He lied to the public, lied to the press, lied to his own children. But the most dangerous lie he told was that he had changed. Sometimes evil doesn't wear a mask. Sometimes it just learns how to smile. Keith Sims, the ghost in the suburbs. He didn't leave notes, he didn't call the press. He didn't even have a name, at least not one that the public knew. For decades, he was just a phantom in Sydney's suburbs, a figure that came and went in the night, leaving behind broken lives, unanswered questions, and a growing trail of fear. From 1985 to 2001, more than a dozen women were attacked across various neighborhoods in Sydney. The locations were different, parks, homes, walking paths, but the method was always eerily similar. The man struck suddenly, violently, and without warning. He wore a disguise, covered his face, sometimes threatened his victims. Other times he was calm, methodical, controlled. Police called him the Bondi Beast, but they didn't know who he was, not his name, not his age, not even what he looked like. For years, investigators worked in the dark. They collected DNA from multiple crime scenes, confirmed they were dealing with the same man, but could never match it to anyone in the system. Every lead went cold. Every sketch led nowhere. Meanwhile, the man behind it all kept living his life. Keith Sims had a job, a family, a reputation. To everyone who knew him, he was just another man from the neighborhood. He attended football matches, went on vacations, smiled in family photos, and no one suspected a thing. It wasn't until 2016, years after his last known attack, that science finally caught up. Investigators used new DNA technology, not to match him directly, but to build a genetic profile through public ancestry databases. Piece by piece, they constructed a family tree, narrowed down the branches, and landed on a single name: Keith Sims. When police approached him in 2022, it was already too late. Sims had died just months earlier from cancer. He was never arrested, never interrogated. But the DNA was a perfect match. The truth left a trail of shock in its wake. Friends, neighbors, even family had no idea. The man they trusted, the man they loved, had lived with this secret for over 30 years. And the women he attacked? Many had given up hope that justice would ever come. Some were stunned, others relieved. But none of them got the chance to confront him. Keith Sims was a predator who understood timing. He didn't need headlines or nicknames. He just needed the system to ignore him long enough to disappear into old age. In the end, he did what many serial offenders only dream of. He got away with it, lived out his life, and died before the truth caught up. John Cooper, the killer. Behind the smile. In the quiet countryside of West Wales, John Cooper was known as a handyman, a man who enjoyed fishing, darts, and the familiarity of small-town life. He lived with his wife, raised 2 children, and appeared to be just another working-class local trying to get by. No one suspected that behind his calm demeanor and worn work boots, Cooper was hiding a history of violence that spanned decades. His early criminal career was built around burglaries. He broke into homes across Pembrokeshire, stealing small valuables, often without leaving a trace. To police, he was just one of many local criminals, persistent, perhaps dangerous, but manageable. That perception would prove tragically naive. In 1985, siblings Helen and Richard Thomas were found dead in their farmhouse. Helen had been bludgeoned to death. Richard had been shot. Their house was then set on fire, seemingly in an attempt to destroy evidence. The brutality shocked the community, but no arrests were made. 4 years later, in 1989, Peter and Gwenda Dixon were murdered while walking along a coastal path. Both were shot at close range. Their bank cards were stolen, and money was withdrawn from nearby towns. Again, the crime went unsolved. The connection between the 2 double murders wasn't obvious. Cooper's crimes were spaced out, carefully executed, and committed with enough variation to confuse investigators. And in between these killings, he returned to his ordinary life, playing darts at the pub, helping neighbors with odd jobs, even appearing on the British game show Bullseye just weeks after murdering the Dixons. Years later, that episode would become a key piece of evidence. A witness sketch from the Dixon case bore a striking resemblance to Cooper's face during his game show appearance. But for years, the link went unnoticed. It wasn't until the early 2000s, when forensic science had advanced, that the pieces began to fall into place. Investigators re-examined old evidence, firearm residue, fibers, DNA, and matched it to Cooper. When police searched his home, they found hidden firearms and stolen property from his burglaries. He was arrested in 2009. During his trial in 2011, Cooper was convicted of 4 murders, numerous burglaries, and sexual assaults. The image of the quiet handyman collapsed in court, replaced by the reality of a violent, manipulative predator who had operated in plain sight. John Cooper had managed to lead 2 lives, one built on charm, normalcy, and routine, the other on brutality and control. His ability to hide in plain view wasn't due to brilliance. It was due to indifference, timing, and luck, until, finally, the evidence caught up. Russell Williams, the officer who hid in plain sight. He wore the Canadian Armed Forces uniform with honor. Decorated, disciplined, and widely respected, Colonel Russell Williams was a model officer. He piloted jets for political leaders, commanded one of the country's largest air bases, and stood as a symbol of national pride. To those around him, he was precise, courteous, and controlled. But behind the military accolades and the polished image, Williams was leading a secret life, one that would horrify a nation. His double life began with break-ins. For years, Williams targeted women's homes in quiet Ontario neighborhoods, often when no one was home. He didn't steal money or valuables. He took lingerie, hundreds of pieces. He meticulously photographed them, catalogued the items, and recorded himself wearing them. The acts were deeply private, yet obsessively documented, evidence of a mind spiraling deeper into control and fantasy. Then the crimes escalated. In 2009, 2 women were sexually assaulted in their homes. The attacks were calculated and predatory, carried out with a level of planning that left almost no trace. Victims were blindfolded, photographed, and assaulted for hours before being left behind. It wasn't random, it was ritual. But the mask truly slipped in 2010 when 27-year-old Jessica Lloyd disappeared. Investigators, tracking tire impressions near her home, conducted a roadside checkpoint. Among the vehicles that passed through was Russell Williams's Nissan Pathfinder. The tire marks matched. Suspicion mounted. Williams was brought in for questioning. At first, he denied everything. But investigators had already begun searching his home. What they found shattered any illusion of innocence. Hidden boxes filled with women's underwear, hundreds of disturbing photographs, videos of the assaults, and eventually a full confession. In cold, unemotional detail, Williams admitted to the murders of Jessica Lloyd and Corporal Marie-France Comeau, a fellow officer under his command. He also confessed to 2 other sexual assaults and over 80 break-ins. He had lived a life of control, both in the military and in his crimes, carefully separating one world from the other until they collapsed into each other. He was sentenced to life in prison, stripped of his rank, his medals, and every honor he had earned. His mugshot, taken in a white undershirt, seated, expressionless, replaced the image of the confident, uniformed colonel who once stood beside Canada's political elite. Russell Williams wasn't just a criminal. He was a symbol of how deception can flourish behind the most trusted faces. His crimes weren't just about violence. They were about dominance, secrecy, and the belief that control could protect him from consequence. But in the end, even the most carefully built lives can crumble under the weight of the truth. They didn't hide in forests. They didn't live off the grid. They lived among us for decades. Some were teachers, soldiers, policemen. They smiled in photos, paid taxes, raised children, and all the while, they killed. Years went by. Evidence gathered dust. But science advanced. Mistakes resurfaced. And secrets cracked. Some were caught by DNA, some by pure chance, and others never at all. Because time doesn't erase guilt. It only delays the reckoning. And sometimes justice whispers long after the blood has dried.